I'd like to turn the microphone now to Emily Morrison.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today. And I'm already finding it hard to find things to say that my esteemed panellists haven't already said better. So at the Young Foundation's Institute for Community Studies, we're a What Works centre, but I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers, sadly, in response to the idea that academics only point out problems, and we very rarely do come with solutions. As an academic turned to applied practitioner and community development leader, I can definitely resonate with that. But at the Young Foundation, we are about building shaping a fairer future, and addressing social and spatial inequalities is an absolutely critical part of that. So I just wanted to share not answers, but perhaps learnings about what we've seen has and hasn't worked, and what could work, as we look at the huge, magnitude of challenges, both acute but also long-term, that face not just this wonderful region, which I share heritage with as well, but also, lots of regions and the hyper-local to regional communities across the country. We did a study in 2020 called Why Don't They Ask Us? The title comes directly from one of the community commissioners that took part in it, which found that there'd been a 0% change in relative deprivation between different places in the last 20 years, despite huge millions and millions of pounds of investment through place-based policies and schemes. And what that means by 0% change in relative deprivation is that the 20% of places that were the most deprived, 20 years ago are still relatively the most deprived now. And so what does that tell us? That says that something has to change in how you do place-based policy making. It's a really, really clear example that what has been being done hasn't worked, and that we need new approaches to place-based policy making. And to give you some specific examples of what we found, through that study, because we are an evidence centre, hadn't worked, there was 4 key things, and Vincent's already touched on some of these, so I'm just going to draw it down to specific instrument level. One was siloed funds. So where there had been funds put in to address particular parts of the problem, but not a holistic integrated solution. So, and we're seeing still, if you're looking at the Towns Fund, you're looking at the Coastal Communities Fund. I'm not saying all of these don't have huge benefits, but we're still in this pattern of siloed funds for specific interests. And quite often the role of communities is often siloed within silos. It's siloed into the bits that they think communities should be allowed to touch or have influence over. We found also had been an over-concentration on city investment, not region. So cities had received, they were the gateways to regional investment. But what that had led to was essentially a sort of pump priming of low-hanging fruit, and in often an increase in within area inequality. So investing in cities is very important, but it can't be our only answer. The next thing was a lack of effective and empowered anchor partnerships, and people have tried any number of models of different partnerships, over the last 20 years. And there's huge learnings from some that had worked much better, but as Vincent also pointed out, the political turmoil often means we throw out the good with the next government. And what we now need, I think, is a real focus on consistent anchor partnerships that work. We need to know what works. We need to diversify what an anchor partnership looks like. We need to diversify who can lead it. That's absolutely crucial. I'll come on to that in a minute. But we also need to not throw out really great anchor partnerships at place-based level every time there is a new fund or a new government, or seek to reinvent the wheel. And as others have pointed out much more articulately than me, the wheels of competition sometimes make that incredibly hard. And finally, what we found was there had been an over-focus in place-based policies on technologicalisation and infrastructure rather than on people-based policies. And those of you who are, sort of really entrenched in how to combat spatial inequalities, will know that there's very, very big tensions between how place-based policies are designed to work and how they are measured to have value by central government, and how people-based policies are designed to work. And what we now need, and what we have lacked over the years, is that integration of place-based policies and people-based policies. Because the people-based policies, which local governments are so familiar with, so brilliant at keeping people's feet to the fire on, are the ones that tend to drive greater equalities of access. and the place-based policies have gaps in how they can interact with those, and we need research funding and also just concerted discussion about how we integrate those. Why is this really important? Well, we also found that within area inequality is actually harder to shift over a 20-year milestone than inequality between regions. And that is perverse because actually we always do a participatory study alongside any evidence review at the Institute. It's part of our commitment to putting people at the heart of research. And what we found was within place inequality, so inequality within a region, so say how someone sitting in Bradford feels about Leeds, that's what people and communities feel the most. They don't actually sit there always hating at London or always hating at the next big city. And we did a study called Discomfort, Dissatisfaction and Disconnect, where people really highlighted that what they wanted local government, national government, researchers, people with power to focus on was within area inequality, was making people in Bradford feel as proud as people in Leeds or vice versa of their different assets and of their opportunities in life. And we worked very closely in Leeds and Bradford in both of these studies. So this brings me on to the value of Y-PERN and this fantastic investment there. And it's because we need mechanisms, what this research shows, we need mechanisms to work across region and also across institution with a much greater diversity of actors and with a much more concerted long-term investment than has been previously granted. And I'm really heartened that a number of Research Council funds are going in the direction of longer-term infrastructure, but there's still an enormous amount to go. And that is because place and region is where you can really reconcile people and place-based policy making, but it's also where you can innovate. And what we have, the next reason for this is because we need structures for research and evidence-based policy making that are reconciled with how funding is now happening and how crises are now happening. So when I mean crises, and others have talked about this, particularly Kirsten England at the start, crises are now intersectional, they need integrated solutions, and they are multitudinous, and they're often long-term as well as acute. And what that means is that we need policy making and research into evidence structures that can mirror that. So they need to be interdisciplinary, not siloed. They need to be cognizant of lived experience as well as statistical data. They need to be able to work agilely as well as be there for the longer term. I'm giving you quite a wish list, aren't I? I do apologise, but it's still the morning, so hopefully you've got energy for it. And what do I mean by how funding happens? And this is perhaps more practical rather than just pointing out a problem. You'll be very aware, and there's some absolutely brilliant examples within Yorkshire, of the growth in public and private partnership funding, and particularly the role of social investment. And at the Young Foundation, part of what we do, as well as community research and social action, is we also look at social investment. We have a young academy where we steward charitable investments from the start, basically, until they can stand on their own 2 feet. Which is part of the work that Michael Young started in the 1950s, and it's part of the work that I'm still proudest of. But what's happening now with public-private partnerships, there's as much as they're the most incredible opportunity to transform our public services, transform some of our large capital projects and infrastructure, but it could point at, and the political scientist in me says, this is another fragmentation as well that we need to watch out for. And it's a fragmentation that means unless we mobilise the connective infrastructure at a research, development and policy making level to connect up those investments and to provide people with a framework for investing in a region that is demand-led rather than, social investors spotting the low-hanging fruit or, being driven by one agenda or another, we are going to risk creating that within area inequality that has already happened out of funding from government, that's been too siloed over the last 20 years. So it's just a note of caution, as much as I completely embrace the work of a lot of social investment and public-private partnerships. I just wanted to move on to the social inequalities question, because I always start my year rather soberingly reading the account of all of the different, economic and social foundations and their brilliant other research in the spirit of also working out what we at the Institute don't need to do, basically. And what I really noticed as I was reading particularly the IFS, so the Institute for Fiscal Studies, outlook on living standards, and then reading the Resolution Foundation's very similar one, and then reading the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's very, very sobering and in fact, dire outlook, is that the gap between national and statistical data that is driving a lot of, policy making investments, including the recent windfalls of levelling up, and the gap between national and statistical data on living standards and the gap between the lived experience of those living standards is getting wider and wider. The IFS was presenting, and it's completely robust according to the data they look at, that there's been surprisingly very little movement in the Gini coefficient, which is, how you measure certain parts of social inequality. Anyone working in this room knows that that cannot be the lived case of this, and that's not just because of inflation. It's because of a complete deficit in discussion and debate about what a reasonable living standard now is in the United Kingdom that has fallen out of our public accountability in the last 10 years. And so what this means, let's turn this into an opportunity, is that networks working at the regional level can be that point of reconciling data. They can reconcile not just national quant data with lived experience data through fantastic community engagement, which you can do through wonderful institutions locally who know the communities and have trust with those communities. But you can also reconcile the brilliant sets of local data. And the colleague over there who'd pioneered, sort of observatories for Yorkshire, knows this much better than I can. And we need networks like Y-PERN to be able to speak truth to power on the real context that you're working in. And that's why I'm so heartened by these kind of local policy innovation networks and partnerships. So I just wanted to end on a note of kind of why do we need this? And, I was asked to talk about the cost of living crisis, but I just also want to talk quickly about the fact that this may be an acute crisis, but it's an acute crisis that is nesting within what Kunster called a long emergency. And I've been spending a lot of time reflecting on long emergencies over the last months. And what he meant by a long emergency, his thesis came out of looking at the oil crisis in the US, a very long time ago, which was destroying the resilience of the energy supply. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Was that his theory was that the role of local areas, local people, institutions, but crucially social relations networks that could transmit knowledge and that could inspire innovation would come into the fore in times of long emergency. And our climate crisis and transition to net zero is our long emergency. It's been long in the making, and it will be long in the transition and the solutions. And so what that points to, I think, is that if we recognise that we are in a long public policy emergency, we need mechanisms and infrastructure that can connect up the radical innovations at a local and regional level with a diversity of assets that can mean that we can put in place both radical innovations that we need, but also shore up a consistent security for communities in the meantime. And we need both. We can't just innovate our way out of this crisis. That moment has very long passed. We are going to need both mechanisms for innovation through anchor partnerships, but also ways of working, consistency through public policy making that give people the security to make the transition to a very, very different way of life that we are going to have to get to. And our work recently on understanding family and community vulnerability for net zero, including wonderfully in 4 neighbourhoods in Leeds, has shown that people on the ground are already aware of that insecurity, both acute and long term. And I think it's time that we used the full capacity of these wonderful investments to really get behind that. Thank you very much.